Ted's going to be Dr. Turnau is going to be presenting 2 talks this morning. We'll take a break between them. We're going to allow plenty of time for Q&A. So I encourage you to take notes, jot down questions that might occur to you as he's speaking. Like I said last night, I discovered Ted Turnau when I came across his book, Apologetics. I would never say it quite right. But this is one excellent book about doing apologetics in a way that relates to the world around us. And so I'm just very grateful that Ted has come back to our area and is giving us a more robust presentation that somewhat tees off this book, but is more reflecting his new book, which has just been approved by InterVarsity Press. So we're getting a great sneak preview of the next publication that's coming about a year from now. So without any further ado, let's welcome Ted Turnau.
All right, and I am being recorded, so if I say anything awful, it's going to be preserved for all time. So, yesterday we asked the big question, why would anyone want to engage culture? And there's lots of reasons. Christ calls us to it, like we're not to be of the world, but we're called into the world. We want to make things different. We want to change the world. The real question then, why do we want to change the world? Or why do we want to engage culture? So we can change the world for the better, for God's glory, for to love the people around us, to be better neighbors. We want to serve others to make the world a better place. We want to serve the common good, not just kind of build our own little fortress. We want to change the world and change the world structure so they better reflect the justice and shalom of the kingdom. The real question then is, how? Because what we really want to do when we're talking about engaging culture is we want to engage the imaginations of those who inhabit the culture. We want to impact the imaginations of people with the reality of a magnificent, loving God and bring the world more into tune with the coming creation. So the real question then is, how? And the answer to that question will heavily depend on what sort of culture we are engaging, what sort of world we think we're trying to change. Knowing what we're up against in terms of this post-Christian world will help us understand what ways of engagement will be more fruitful and which will not be fruitful. And I'd like to start out by kind of stating the obvious for contemporary Europe and to an increasing degree, North America as well. The world we are called to engage in is deeply divided, deeply pluralistic, skeptical about absolute truth claims, and deeply disenchanted with the gospel. That is, the cultures that we live in and are trying to reach are by and large post-Christian. We could say that many parts of it are resistant to the gospel due to prior inoculation. Non-Christians get just enough of the gospel to dismiss it as irrelevant or maybe even harmful because it impinges on their sexual freedom or whatever. That's the culture we're called to engage. The people we are to draw lovingly to Jesus. And incidentally, this may be why, this kind of inoculation may be why revivals happen in the global South and East and not so much in the global North and West, because they've had the gospel for a while and they've developed an immunity So there are two typical responses to this type of post-Christian cultural landscape: fight or flight. Fight, we culture war in order to win the gospel, in order to somehow force a cultural change. We elect politicians, we appoint judges. Or flight, we withdraw into our Christian bubble. We withdraw into our private worlds. Maybe occasionally we evangelize, but on the whole, we stay away from cultural engagement. Let me gently suggest that these two ways are not the best strategies for cultural engagement in a post-Christian world. Not that these things are verboten, like not, you never should be politically involved, or you should never, withdraw for a time to pray and deepen your relationship with God. But as leading strategies for cultural engagement, they both leave a lot to be desired. They are both very incomplete. So we're going to spend this morning, or a good part of the morning, looking at why these two paths aren't such a good strategy if we wish to change the world for the better. And then I would like to suggest a third path, that is planting oases through creative, imaginative engagement with the culture. So let's go to path one, fight. That is the path of politics or culture warring. If the culture is messed up and gospel resistant, well, then let's simply vote people in who can pass laws and make things more sane, more Christian friendly, more the way things used to be. This is the political culture warring path to cultural change, and this has been extensively experimented with in the United States and to some extent in the UK as well. There are serious problems with this approach. The problem is that politics is by definition about the use of power. Lawmakers use power, the power of the law, to steer culture this way and that. And you can be sure that in a pluralistic, divided society like ours, this use of power will involve coercion. And where you have coercion in a deeply pluralistic society, you will generate resentment and an eventual backlash, cultural backlash. If you will allow me a cultural tale, especially for you youngins or people who are newer to this country, take, for example, the Reagan Revolution from 1980 to 1988. Reagan, during his campaign, extended an olive branch to evangelicals and said, if you help me win, I will help get done the things you want to get done. And back then it was mostly prayer in public school and abortion. And for a while, things went well. He kept his promise. Abortion rates went down. Family values were front and center in the national agenda. Even if you didn't agree with the evangelicals, you had to deal with them. But something else happened as well. The alliance between evangelicals and the Republican Party changed the character of evangelicalism itself. It deepened the suspicion and hatred inherent in an already polarized society. So it changed the cultural dynamics as well. Biblically conservative Christians became defined not by their love for each other and for those who are alienated from Christ, but rather by their conservative politics. Because the Republican Party offered evangelical Christians some influence, evangelicals felt obliged to defend whatever Republicans were for and attack whatever Democrats were for because they were automatically the bad guys. Besides producing some really weird admixture, pro-gun, pro-assault weapon Christians, anti-environmentalist Christians, a culture war mentality developed that raged throughout the 1980s and 90s and into the new millennium. Christians became defined in American culture by what we were against, not and by how offended we were at those who lived lifestyles differently than we do. Evangelical Christians in America are now not known as humble, loving people. Far from it. We are considered judgmental and even hateful. And as the culture years have played out, our culture has changed, but not in the ways that the Reagan Revolution intended, and the Bush years hoped for. Yes, there has been a recent huge development in overturning Roe v. Wade, but gay marriage is now an accepted legal institution. And it would not surprise me if the gains made by the conservative politics evaporate in the coming decades. Why? Because the resentment that conservative political victory caused, specifically with progressive culture makers who sort of dominate the centers of cultural production, university teachers, entertainment executives, people like that. The political victories of the 1980s and even of 2022 never impacted their imaginations. The old saying goes, he who is convinced against his will remains unconvinced still, right? You can lead a horse to water, but this horse doesn't want to drink. It does not want to drink the evangelical Kool-Aid. And therefore, for every political victory that we gain, it is only going to deepen the resentment. That approach never really swayed the culture makers. And they're the ones who have the power to influence and shape the collective imagination of American society in the long run. These culture makers felt that their country had been hijacked during the Reagan Revolution and after by a conservative Christian agenda, and it needed desperately to change direction. And it was only a matter of time before you saw a cultural backlash. And the new atheism of Richard Dawkins and company, that is part of that backlash. The reason that the new atheism has had a far greater staying power in the United States than in the United Kingdom, where it first came from, is precisely because of the way that evangelicals and conservative politicians have sort of joined forces and forced their agenda on others. It's recently had a makeover with the kinder, gentler atheism of people like Alain de Botton. But given the Supreme Court victory, we're already seeing a backlash in media and online. I think Christians are more intensely hated now than I've ever seen in my lifetime, which isn't awesome. Not a way to really change culture. As far as influencing American culture in a Godward direction, this just has not happened. And short of a revival that sweeps the nation, which I don't see coming anytime soon, though I'm not a prophet, it's not going to happen either. America at present is simply too divided and too deeply relativistic morally to return to past values wholesale. The political path to cultural change has not made things better from a Christian perspective. It has only further deepened divisions in an already divided country. The political culture war model of cultural engagement just hasn't worked out so well. And my fear is that with the recent SCOTUS ruling, the Supreme Court ruling, Christians will say, no, we did it. And I'm like, you guys don't see the cost. The cost is this ongoing, lingering resentment that will last decades. The political path, however, remains a temptation wherever Christians make up a majority or a sizable minority of society, because it seems so reasonable. If you've got the power, if you've got the votes, why not legislate yourself into a position of cultural power and legitimacy? But given the world that we live in, once more, deeply divided, pluralistic, relativistic, skeptical, inoculated, post-Christian, I believe that's a huge misstep. It's running back into the arms of Emperor Constantine. And for those of you who don't know church history so well, Constantine was the one who legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire and kind of paved the way for his grandson, Theodosius I, to make it the official state religion of the Roman Empire. And it fails to realize, this political path fails to realize that the Constantinian solution is at least partly responsible for our current predicament of being in a post-Christian world. It's responsible for the inoculation against Christianity. That's the lesson taught to us by sociologist David Martin. He's a professor emeritus at the London School of Economics. And he wrote a book in 1978 called A General Theory of Secularization. And to oversimplify a great deal, the takeaway from the book is wherever church and state power have mixed, it is always the church that loses in the long run. It is always the church that ends up the loser in terms of social legitimacy and plausibility in the long term. And the closer the ties between church and state, the more decisive the secularization that inevitably follows. So in France, where the church was a de facto tool of foreign policy for the state, secularization was quick and violent. Strangle the last king with the entrails of the last priest. That was the slogan Diderot, one of the leaders of the French Revolution, said. And France to this day has sort of this knee-jerk secularizing atheistic tendency. If there's anything that the church is doing, oh well, that's and that's the way it stayed. In Scandinavia and Britain, where the connection was looser but still present, you had a state-sponsored church, secularization was experienced as a gradual loss of relevance and legitimacy for the population. In the US, that has historically had a fairly strict separation between church and state, religion fared rather better, though the Reagan, Bush, and now Trump legacy years are seen by many as a sort of informal state sponsorship of the evangelical church. And we've seen a backlash in terms of the attitudes towards evangelicals and decreasing church attendance, especially in those of the millennials and Zoomers, millennials and Gen Z, especially the under 30 population, which demographically does not bode well for the future of the church. The church is now shrinking, in other words, and will do so perhaps for the next 50 years. So why this pattern? Why does a church-state partnership result in a long-term loss of legitimacy for the church? Because David Martin theorized, and it makes sense to me, wherever the church becomes too cozy with the powers that be, it always ends up paying for it in terms of lost social influence. It loses its right to speak prophetically for the powerless, on behalf of the powerless, to those in power when it becomes resident in the halls of power. Another way to put it, wherever Christians have sought to impose their will on society through political coercion, even in subtle ways, they've always ended up paying for it in the currency of lost social legitimacy because of the resentment of the next generation. This has been the story of the rapid or gradual decline of Christian fervor in Europe and in America. When the Christian faith and social order is imposed, it simply inoculates the next generation against the Christian faith, and that inoculation is notoriously hard to overcome. And what is worse, according to James K.A. Smith and his book, Awaiting the King, political power is addictive. It's a type of worship, eventually. It becomes a type of worship, and so it functions in the church as a type of spiritual formation. The ways that we practice politics, and he means politics kind of broadly conceived as the way we order our lives together, that has the power to deform us, to bend us away from what is true and biblical and towards other ends, other goals, even other gods. So, Smith advises us, Christians not to eschew politics, not to avoid it completely, but rather to be ambivalent and hesitant and circumspect in our political allegiances. Otherwise, we end up with Christians whose lived faith becomes co-opted and colonized by idolatries and injustices of various kinds. We end up with what Americans are seeing now, deeply secularized Christians who have a form of the faith, but who have turned their backs on the values of Jesus and undermined the integrity of their faith, all in the name of supporting some political god or other. No matter what Trump has done or is doing now, no matter what he did on January 6th, he's our guy. He's the one who delivered the Supreme Courts. We're with him through thick and thin. And it's just too easy for power politics to become a new golden calf. And that undercuts our witness. And I think it will take generations to undo the damage that the evangelical church has already done to the Christian witness in America. Let me present another exhibit. This is a tweet that's very, very recent. It is June 22nd, sorry, June 25th. So like a week ago. And it says this: think about this. And this is a Christian pastor, by the way. Think about this. If I had 7 or 8 kids and the atheist secularist has 2, not only do I have a 4-to-1 advantage, but then one of my kids converts. He types concerts, but there's no edit function on Twitter. One of my kids converts one of his, and now it's 9-to-1. Then all our kids have 4 kids, and his kid has 2, and I baptize them all, and it's 36 to his 2, 34 net. Just thinking today about how inevitable the church's victory is, we're actually going to win, my guys. And honestly, if Christians started having 4+ kids again, we would win by the end of the century, right? Somebody please tell me what's wrong with this approach. You can't argue with the math, the numbers are there. But are they though? Are they though? As I see it, there are 2 huge glaring potholes of wrongness in this approach. Yes, sir.
But that's just a bad idea.
Okay. So practically, there are families that just should not have 7 or 8 kids. No, seriously, we were really, really close, like 20, 30 years ago. We were really close to a family that kind of believed this, and they had child after child after child. What they didn't or semi-realized, their marriage was kind of a mess. But every baby that came into the house, everything was like cute and adorable for a while until the baby got old enough to talk. And then things would get bad again. And then they'd have another baby. And we were leading a Bible study with them or for them. And we're like, dudes, stop having kids, please. And they're like, no, you quiver full of children, blah, blah. No, this is putting more stress on your marriage. Please don't. And they are divorced today. And every one of their children is not walking with the Lord. Right? So when you're saying practically some people shouldn't have that many kids, you right. You very, very right. But let's assume a perfect world where Christians could actually have 7 or 8 kids. Yes. Yeah. For those of you at home, and I know we're not doing the anyway, for those of you at home, it treats the secularists like an enemy. We're just going to dominate the heck out of you through genetic superiority. Gosh, yeah, what does that sound like? It is a horrible way to treat somebody who's not our enemy, right? Rather than treating them as someone who's made in the image of God, who needs Jesus. And the second thing is, I don't know that you're going to keep that number advantage, because kids will see that approach as ugly and they will leave the church. And that's happening now. That's happening right now. If we want to play the numbers game, we are not going to be in a dominant position by the end of the century. Absolutely not. Because we are going to start churning out babies that we see more as tools than as children. And they will see the way we treat other people who believe differently, and they will say, no, thank you. And they will walk away. That is the kind of thing I'm talking about. He's not churning out Christians, he's churning out future voters to get his agenda through. So if you want to talk about numbers, shouldn't we be loving people that we differ with? Shouldn't we be striving to love these people? The only winning there is in the Christian faith here is if we win them over, not to our side, but to Jesus' side. Again and again, like we have to be won over again and again to Jesus' side. That's called repentance and humility. And right now, we're not flourishing in those areas. We need to be won over as much as the secularist does. All right, enough ranting. Okay, so please understand what I am not saying. I am not saying that Christians should avoid politics altogether, as if that were possible in today's world. I'd really like to avoid politics. I'm finding it really hard to nowadays. And I'm not saying that no Christian should ever run for office or seek to build coalitions and so forth. Christians should be represented in our body politic. And their voices should be heard, but we need to do so with a real interest to the common good and not simply as just one more self-focused political interest group. We need to learn how to practice our politics without making enemies. We need to love people with whom we differ. We need to conduct ourselves politically with humility and love. And for those of us who aren't in politics, which is most of us, you need to pray a lot for the people who are, because the temptations to be jerks and to be manipulative are many. They need a ton of wisdom and patience. Let me give you a counterexample. I don't know if you guys know who this is. This is the president of Chick-fil-A named Dan Cathy, and on the right, you're right, is a guy named Shane Windemeyer of Campus Pride, a college LGBTQ plus rights group. And they came into contact, I think somewhere around 2014, maybe earlier. Dan Cathy gave an interview to a Southern Baptist paper about how we're family-run businesses and we believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, blah, 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 blah. And somehow the mainstream press got hold of it and it blew up. And gay people were growling and everybody was like, boycott Chick-fil-A. You probably had a lot of that up here, right? If you have any Chick-fil-A's up here. Do you have Chick-fil-A up here? Yeah, okay. Don't go to Chick-fil-A. And the evangelicals responded by, eat as much Chick-fil-A as possible. And it was like this. And so it just seemed like this impasse and bashing heads. But behind the scenes, Dan Cathy got contact information for Shane Windemeyer and asked if they could meet. and Shane resisted for a while, saying, no, this is a trap. And all his friends were like, no, you can't trust this guy. But Kathy was relentless, kept calling him, kept texting him, saying, please, I'd really, really like to meet. So they met. And Kathy just listened. I said, I just want to listen. And then they met again and again. And pretty soon Shane Windemeyer was coming to their house for Thanksgiving. And Shane Windemeyer was going to football games in Kathy's box, and he was like a VIP in the Kathy household. And never once did Dan Cathy ask Shane to stop the boycott. And when they got to discussing issues, Windemeyer said, there are these groups that we think are corrosive of gay rights, and you're funding them. And Kathy said, okay. And he stopped funding them. But what happened instead was then Shane Windemeyer wrote an article for the HuffPost saying why I love Dan Cathy. And like Christians were yelling at Dan Cathy saying, you gave up you gave up your position, and he's not a politician, but he's inevitably embroiled in politics. And gay people started yelling at Shane Windemeyer saying, how dare you? How can you give this man a platform? But the fact is, whatever else happened, they now see each other as human beings who love and respect each other. And that's not nothing. It's not about just winning games. It's about relationship. So hear me when I say, I'm not saying no politics. I'm saying that we must be very intentional about how we do politics, doing politics in a way that is itself God-honoring. The means matter. The ends do not justify the means. We are called to use godly means for godly ends. We need to, even politically, follow the path that Christ, of the Christ who humbled himself and sought us out. Yeah, that's them in a football game. Okay, path 2, the path of pietistic withdrawal. The reaction of a lot of Christians, especially in the UK, but a lot here in the US as well, has been to say, ew, I don't want any part of that culture warring stuff. Just leave me alone to live a quiet Christian life. These tend to be good, salt of the earth people who feel that when the world's going to the dogs, you better stay out of the kennel. When the dogs are running wild, you stay out of the street. The impulse to withdraw into these cloistered communities has been stated most forcefully and for some most persuasively by this guy, writer and editor of the magazine, The American Conservative, named Rod Dreher. And he wrote a book in 2017 called The Benedict Option. Dreher calls for a strategic withdrawal from culture, especially popular culture, and you guys know that went over well with me, to escape from what he calls the deluge of modernity. He, in earlier American conservative essays, he liked to refer to the acid bath of modernity, but he's since kind of shifted metaphors to more flood imagery. Modern culture, he argues, is relativistic, obsessively self-centered, and hostile to those committed to the Christian faith. So obviously, we should get out if we want to save our skins and remain a light for the world. Just as Saint Benedict, when the Roman Empire was crumbling, withdrew to the woods and founded an intentional community as to be a shining light as civilization fell apart. So, Dreher argues, conservative Christians must withdraw from our present toxic culture into intentional communities and focus on spiritual formation and preserving our Christian roots and values. Dreher calls these intentional communities thick communities. And these are communities in which people can form habits through which they develop a thick culture that will foster holy living. These communities are high commitment and deeply relational. By forming these quasi-monastic communities, he argues we can preserve the faith past the deluge that threatens all of Western culture. If we fail to do this, Dreyer argues, if we fail to preserve our Christian roots, if we become compromised by the world, there will be nothing left for civilization to return to once it's crumbled. There's no way for our society to move past its present darkness. There are several reasons why I don't think this is the best path forward for Christians in a post-Christian culture. The first is this: are thick community and cultural engagement mutually exclusive? Is it possible to engage without compromise? And as we discussed yesterday, it is possible. And I would say more pointedly, they need each other. You cannot have a faithful, gospel-centered cultural engagement without staying rooted in thick relationships in the church. And I don't think you can really have a gospel-centered community without cultural engagement. A church saved by grace will necessarily want to be engaged with the world. Mission is the natural response to the gospel. Another way to put that, do we really have the license to ignore Jesus' call that sends us out into the world? We may not be called overseas like Carolyn and I were, but we are sent into the world nonetheless. Jesus is fairly explicit. Go into all the nations and make disciples. And I do not hear an exception to preserve a safe space for us and our families. It's our connection, as I said yesterday, it's our connection with the word, not our separation from culture that brings us holiness, that sanctifies us, especially since this is the world that Jesus calls us to. Which leads me to my third critique of this strategy that seeks to withdraw from the world so that after the dark ages are past, we may again reclaim our rightful place in the world. It's just a really insular kind of motivation. It's motivated by self-protection rather than love for those around us. A bunker mentality simply does not fit the Christian gospel of love and grace. The church is not there to be a refuge to keep you and yours safe. Rather, it is to be an equipping station as we move out into the world to love and serve those around us. Fourth criticism. Dreyer and many other Christians who find safety in the Christian bubble see nothing but darkness when they look around at the corruption in post-Christian culture. There is no recognition that there are places of light and blessing and common grace in the world. In other words, there are reasons for hope in our engagement with the world, and we don't have the right to overlook these. They are gifts of God. You don't want to be an ungrateful person. And finally, it seems that this path kind of lacks confidence in God's control over history. It lacks confidence in his grace and providence for his people. It even lacks confidence in God's ability to save. Dreyer's doctrine of salvation, if we can put it that way, is by faith in the bubble, in the conservative community to save, rather than God. But conservative communities cannot save. And when we try to make them into our saving hope, they often become toxic. They often become toxic and overly confining. And you get all sorts of weird abuse and stuff going on, which we've seen hit the news. It's okay, but God can and does save. He alone is our ultimate hope. It's okay to risk engagement with the world, not only because we are called to it, by the love of Christ, but because we are all finally safe in the arms of our Father. And this safety lies in the power of a loving God and not in our ability to wall ourselves off from a scary world. We can be courageous because ultimately we are covered by the blood of the Lamb and by the Father's hands. For all these reasons, I do not find the path of pietistic withdrawal, particularly the Benedict option, persuasive or a viable path for Christians whom God has called into the world. That is not to say, however, that there is nothing of value in Dreyer's book. I think the evangelical church, conservative Christians desperately need to work on thick community. We need to work on our community building, but we are not called to community for the sake of community. We are called to community to pursue God, each other, and those who need Christ. Is there another option? Is there a path that avoids both the coercion and backlash involved in the culture war on the one hand, and the quietism and insularity of pietistic withdrawal on the other? Is there a way of building bridges out into the culture in constructive ways? And the answer is yes, obviously. One is acts of sacrificial service to the community, feeding the poor, housing the homeless, advocacy on social justice issues, giving voiceless a voice, the biblical injunction to watch out for orphans and widows and migrants and things like that, to watch out for the poor and dispossessed. And that can happen in all sorts of ways. There's an English guy that I spoke to, old guy, retired, who lived near a housing estate, a poor people housing, what we call them, the projects, I guess we'd call them in the States. And there was this abandoned building in the middle of this apartment complex, and he asked the landlord if he could spruce it up and use it. And he uses it as an after-school club to help kids with homework. And that's the safe place they go to. And he's there, 3 o'clock every afternoon. The kids come and they work till 5, and then they go their merry ways and go to dinner. That's being a light. That's building bridges. That's how people in your community learn to see the church as love, as light. And second, there's a whole bunch of church initiated habits of hospitality and intentional community that are aimed at eradicating the postmodern scourge of loneliness and isolation, which online communities don't really help with. Again, this can have a profound impact on local culture, giving many people who suffer from broken families, broken relationships, who are looking for a home, someplace to be. That's the church being the church. But I'm not going to talk about these two because they're kind of obvious. I want to move on to one that is a little more overlooked. And that is the path of creative engagement. And I want to illustrate this path with a parable that I call the oasis that was really a portal to another universe. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a traveler who habitually trekked throughout a dry and hostile land. It didn't bother him too much, for it was all he knew. One day he saw in the distance a patch of greenery. That much color in a land of unbroken dust brown enticed him, and he set out for it. As he drew closer, the patch of green revealed more detail to him. This was a place of tall trees, lush undergrowth, and wildflowers. He entered into the shade and found at the center of the oasis a still pool of crystal clear water. But he found that he was not alone. There was a man across the pool from him, staring intently at the bottom of the pool. The traveler inquired why the man was staring so. Perhaps he had seen a fish. No, the man replied. No fish, something more remarkable. See for yourself. The traveler stared intently and saw something glimmering at the bottom of the pool. It might have been just the shimmering sunlight refracted onto the rocks below, but no, it was something more. He couldn't see it too well, but he found the light mesmerizing. It entranced him in a way he could not put easily into words. He cautiously asked the man across the pool about the glimmering light, what he thought it was. They talked about it until the sky grew dark and it was time for him to move on. But he was so intrigued that he came back the next day, both to gaze into the pool and to continue his conversation with the stranger. The stranger had brought food, and so they shared a meal together as they continued talking, sharing ideas and theories about the mysterious light at the bottom of the pool. The traveler resolved to return again the next day, and so he did. This became his habit for some time. Gradually, he found that he had become more and more dissatisfied with the dry and hostile land. He much preferred the cool shade of the oasis and the company offered there. Eventually, the stranger lost his strangeness and became a trusted friend and discussion partner. And all the while, the light at the bottom of the pool came more and more into focus, as if someone were adjusting a hidden lens. Whole cities full of light and life began to take shape before his unbelieving eyes. The traveler knew it was impossible, for cities do not reside at the bottom of ordinary pools. Nevertheless, he continued to study the image. He sensed in it a piercing beauty that entranced and drew him magnetically, almost more than he could bear. He loved his time gazing into the pool, and yet he felt a profound sadness as well, for the light stirred in him deep grief as well as deep gladness. It became increasingly obvious that this was no ordinary pool. It was rather a doorway to another world, another way of being. It also became apparent that the man who had been a stranger and was now his friend had in effect become his guide. It was only a matter of time before the traveler would take the plunge to the bottom of the pool to begin the most improbable, miraculous journey he could have ever imagined. That is what I mean when I talk about Christian creatives who are planting oases. Oases are breathable spaces that creatively challenge both Christian and non-Christian imaginations to see differently, question assumptions, provoke conversations, a space for building relationships. Please note what I do not mean. I do not mean building the Christian bubble, providing safe spaces that appeal primarily to a Christian audience, creating an alternative subculture. And I also don't think it's about representation, having more Christians, characters on shows and stuff like that, although that's important in itself. It's about becoming a part of a broader cultural conversation that invites both Christians and non-Christians in. It's about engaging the imaginary landscape, the shared hopes, dreams, fears, and anxieties of post-Christian cultures so that they can begin to see the gospel as the good news, as true and beautiful. I would like to see the church gain a better understanding of the imagination and start building networks to support those who can do this sort of creative work well. In this way, we step away from the culture wars and from a kind of sheltered distance, although I'm not against, distancing in general. That was a joke. Never mind. A sheltered distance from the world, and we begin instead to speak into our culture, life, and peace. There is a lot of overlap between what I'm proposing and what artist Makoto Fujimura calls culture care. That is, instead of envisioning as our culture as a battleground to be won, we rather see it as a garden that we collectively care for. In the book, he tells the story of Koyu Abe, a Japanese Buddhist monk who lived near the Fukushima nuclear power plant that spilled radioactive waste into the soil after being hit by the tsunami in 2011. And this monk went around and passed out millions and billions of sunflower seeds to the residents of Fukushima because he knew that sunflowers absorb radioactivity from the soil and kind of store it in the heads of the sunflowers. So people in this area have been planting sunflowers year after year after year in hopes that one day the soil will be safe enough for people to plant gardens there once again. And likewise, Fujimura argues Christians through their creative efforts can serve to renew the cultural landscape, removing toxic conflict and life-killing patterns that have poisoned our common culture for too long. So why do I focus on imagination and creative cultural engagement? For two reasons. There's a lingering suspicion of the imagination from conservative Christians, and so evangelicals don't tend to understand the imagination that well, or what it's really for, and that leads to a crisis in the aesthetic witness of the church, which makes it harder for people to take the Christian faith seriously. Let me look at both of those briefly. First, there is a large portion of the Christian church that sees orthodoxy and imagination as enemies, as antithetical terms. It's like we're afraid that if you embrace the life of the imagination too much, you'll lose your anchor in good doctrine and godly living. And part of that is because artists and creative types have in the past despised sound doctrine and conventional lifestyles. They want to live free from the rules no matter who they hurt, especially if it's themselves. And that's pretty scary and awful from a Christian perspective, but does it have to be? Wasn't Jesus one of the most imaginative and creative people around in the history of ever? Let's return to the DJ that I introduced you to yesterday, who asked me what he should do, given the fact that that his church really wasn't behind, that his church said, "Why are you playing music for druggies? Why would you be in there?" And he said, "Should I stop and follow another line of work?" And I said to him, no, that's exactly where you should be. That's exactly where Christians need to be. It's a challenging it's a challenging calling, and that brother needs prayer and support and accountability, but that's exactly where he should be. I truly believe that if Jesus were walking the earth today, he'd be hanging out with lost souls. Maybe he'd be spinning in the clubs. After all, this was the guy who provided the wine to get the wedding party started. Why would he not also provide the sick beats? Now, we find such language kind of shocking, but why? Because we Christians are so hesitant and even suspicious of arts and imagination, and that suspicion of the imagination has had several effects on the church and how it is perceived by the watching world. Christians, first of all, tend to withdraw into our safe zones because we don't trust the imagination. We tend to withdraw into our Christian bubbles, as we have seen, and this turns into an amazing lack of aesthetic discernment when it comes to actually putting out products. What is flashing on the screen? It looks like someone's crying for help. Is that showing up there? No. Okay, it's only showing on what I can see. Sorry, guys. All right, never mind. So turns into an amazing lack of aesthetic discernment, and that in turn leads to a serious image problem for the church. It makes it difficult for non-Christians to take the gospel seriously. Some years ago, an English church put up a website called The Big Objections, and it asked people anonymously to share what they thought were their biggest obstacles to faith and between them and the Christian faith. And one commenter said this: "The church has diluted Jesus' message. Its people are impotent and cowardly. Its music and art reflects its nature, mediocre and blandly revolting. The media condescend and pacify its people with anemic shows like S of P, that is Songs of Praise. It's a weekly show that comes on the BBC. It's a horror story on prime time. If Jesus was dead, he'd be at 12,000 RPM in his grave. In other words, what Christians produce culturally, bland, mediocre, anemic, reflects on Christians and the reality of the Christian faith, at least for this person. And I suspect for many others. And non-Christians want nothing to do with it for good reason. And I need to plug in because my computer says, you must plug me in or you're going to lose power. Maybe. I'll trade you. Thank you. Okay, sorry for that interruption. Totally my bad. I just forgot about it earlier. Okay. You can have as powerful an apologetics as you want. You can have as powerful a proclamation ministry as you wish. But if the imaginative products of your community are mediocre, sentimental, and sappy, or ugly propaganda, your public voice will falter and crash and burn because of the aesthetic obstacles your community has erected for the unbeliever. That is to say, there is such a thing as the aesthetic witness of the Church of Jesus Christ. And I want us to think about whether or not we're living up to that aesthetic calling, whether we have been the kind of imaginative community that God wants us to be. I think a lot of Christians don't even know that we have an aesthetic calling. My aim for these talks is to start a conversation about among churches and within churches. Where that conversation leads, whether it's, we have so much work to do, or, wow, that guy was crazy, moving on. That's totally up to you. So the reason we're going on an extended exploration of the imagination and art and stuff like that is to help us think through the aesthetic calling of the church. I think it's something we need to think through carefully, especially in our post-Christian gospel-resistant culture. We don't want to be adding to the anti-gospel inoculation in our through our cultural creations. And I'm convinced one of the reasons we struggle with our aesthetic witness is we have a very hazy understanding of the imagination. And we have a very hazy understanding of what art is for and why there is art. So that's what we're going to be exploring in the next talk. And I think we have a, 15-minute, 20-minute? Yeah. A something break. A 20-minute break. Okay. Oh, right. I'm sorry. I don't want to shut you guys down. Sure. Q&A away. So any questions? I presented a whole bunch of, I just downloaded a whole bunch of information. Sure, sir. Wait. Pastor says you need to use a mic. It all goes on record. Wow. The title card was a way to reference Evangelion. No, it's this is actually a talk that I gave in 2018 to a big Christian conference called New Word Alive. And so, or Word Alive, and so W is right there. And because the only way I can watch my notes and have this go on Zoom at the same time is by giving the pastor a copy of it and running it off of your system and then looking at it here, which changes all the fonts. And so it all came out kind of weird because you don't have the same fonts downloaded as I did. Yeah. Just a coincidence, a happy coincidence. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it seems like this is a lot of it is about being able to hold your ground and still be able to effectively communicate with the outside world. And I think it's a temptation to take the shortcut, which makes it easy to build walls around you.
Mhm.
We see that a lot in churches around the world, and just build a fortress and protect yourself, and lose your contact with, or even your understanding of the outside world, and as a result, your art looks very mediocre. But on the other hand, if you really want to communicate effectively, it's hard work. And I think that's probably where the focus is.
Yeah. Well said, well said. Effective communication takes hard work. It takes training. It takes finding the talented members of your own communities and investing in them. We started talking about this yesterday, but it means getting on board with what creatives are doing. I think the only thing I disagree with in what you said is standing your ground. That I don't know that the church needs to be about hunkering down, standing your ground, as much as it needs to be about moving out and loving. And maybe that's
We
that's
had an
just a
incident
metaphor.
the other week. There was someone who we invited to our small group Bible study,
Uh-huh.
and he also claimed to be a Christian, and he has a very liberal interpretation of the Christian faith,
Sure.
even about some of the biblical facts like Jesus.
Yeah.
died and
Resurrection,
rose. Yeah,
resurrection.
He
Yes.
disagreed.
Yeah.
And then again, and there was a long talk about whether that was true or not. It ended with a very unhappy ending because he decided not to come. He said, I've come to the wrong place," and
Yeah.
made a lot of points. So things like that. You could be 1 to 10 in a group, whereas you feel like you're either consumed, give up your point of view, or
Okay, sure. Yeah, I am not saying, okay, so that's what you meant by stand your ground. No, I'm not saying betray or be unfaithful to the word as it's been given. Obviously not. But there is in a lot of churches, especially evangelical churches, this fear that we have to maintain ourselves or we're going to collapse or the church is going to collapse. There was a really interesting interview with the Archbishop of Canterbury, or maybe ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. And he said, I don't like, there's been decline in the Church of England. And he's like, I don't like when people talk about the dying church and we're dying and stuff like that. The way the New Testament talks about it, the church is the place where you find life. And outside the church is death. We don't have to worry about us dying. We need to be inviting people into the place of life rather than being so consumed about how we're going to keep ourselves afloat. So I think that sort of poverty mindset, that we're the victims, we are being oppressed, we're losing cultural influence. That's what I see in a lot of the interaction between the church and the broader culture. And it's the opposite of the truth. Like we're the opposite of the emperor's new clothes. The emperor's new clothes is, he thinks he's dressed in rich robes, he's buck naked. And we think we're buck naked and starving when in fact we've got all the riches in the world. We're, regardless of whether we've got political influence, we are the Church of Christ, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And this is where you find life. And so what's the problem, right? We're not that easily threatened, or we shouldn't be that easily threatened. And I think we need to start changing our mindset about our relationship to the world so that we're not constantly kind of poking at the world and stirring up a hornet's nest and then sorry we did and stuff like that. So anyway, yes, good question. I do agree. Gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you, Ted. Actually, our family was in Prague last month,
Were they?
Oh, yeah.
We missed each other.
We miss each other, but now we see you in your life. I like the Oasis approach.
Uh-huh.
Traditionally, the church have been serving the local community, especially the Chinese community, the students from different colleges and, in the town of Amherst. But now the difficulty we're facing is, it's harder and harder to invite people to church. So what kind of oasis can we create for the people around us?
So I'm going to have to apologize. The Oasis metaphor is not something you just do next week. It's something that takes time to build a culture within the church in which you have creatives going out from your midst, planting oases outside of the church in the culture around. And these works could be novels, these works could be songs, these works could be computer games, these works can be whatever, that are going to impact and invite in non-Christians as well as Christians. And over time, that may soften hearts and allow conversations to take place, conversations that are really hard at present. One of the guys at the publisher called it imaginative hospitality, right? Creating spaces where people are partying in. And that's like a decades-long vision. This is something that the Christian church has been underinvesting in for hundreds of years. It's not going to turn around immediately. What can we do now? I think you need students who are in your church already, who are living in the dorms as light, and just making friendships, talking with people as if they're, it's sort of like dating in a weird way. There are some people who treat dating as a game, and there's like these 5 points that if you really want to be a player and you want to, and then you start criticizing her looks so that she feels a little vulnerable, and then you move in, and there's all this like manipulative stuff out there. And then there was a game streamer and being a game streamer, he's being watched by a whole bunch of, lonely, defective males. And so he gave dating advice, and he said, look, the way you get into a relationship with a girl is you are friends with her and you treat her like a normal human being. And that's it. That's the thing. You just be in relationship with them. And if there's something that resonates between you two, maybe it develops from there. And I think Christians need to have something of the same mindset. In the world, don't be a jerk. Be a kind person and talk with people about stuff in ways that is sensitive to where they are. If you are show concern about them. Let me give you another example. There's this, we do movie nights at our house. We invite students in, and there's this one guy, or trans guy, was woman, is in the process of becoming male, from Russia. And this person took my Understanding Media Fandom course. And part of that course, I have them write a paper, which we call this fandom self-ethnography, in which you kind of trace what you were a fan of at this part in your life. And you kind of do a psychological inventory to figure out why you were a fan of this thing, like what was going on in your life that you needed this fandom, and do it. And these papers can go awfully, awfully deep. And this particular person was sharing stuff in his paper that was just like, this person has long-term health difficulties, father who was abusive, then abandoned, all sorts of, got into all sorts of weird, dangerous things, struggles with depression. Like, the trans thing is like the least of the concerns. And so we invited him over for spaghetti. And I just like, you okay? Like, I've read a lot of papers, but it's not very often that I'm like, I need to see this person just to make sure they're not going to commit suicide. So are you okay? And it's like, yeah, I'm okay. And we talked, and the gospel did come up because he's interested in religion. Every church he's been to, he's gotten the impression that you do something for God, God does something for you. And I was like, no, that's not the gospel. The gospel is God has already done everything for you, and anything you do in return is out of gratitude. And then I stopped and I was like, but you haven't heard this, have you? And he was like, no. And I was like, oh, okay. And from that point on, this person comes to every movie night, comes early so that he can play with our cats because Mrs. Cat's back in Moscow. Always comes with a big bottle of alcohol because that's how Russians do. And just, I wouldn't say that he's a Christian, but we're maintaining relationship with him, and we're looking for opportunities to talk and go deeper. And I would be glad, once we get to the place where we have enough students who might be interested, would love forming a Bible study with this person. Can you imagine having this person in a Bible study? That would be hilarious. Be amazing. So so I would just say have Christian students in the dorms who are living like Christians and are living like Christians who love the people around them. And you will find over time people want to come and find out what's going on with this Bible study thing. But especially in this landscape that we're in now, that's going to take a long time. You can't put up a flyer and expect people just to show up. That happens in Africa. That doesn't happen here. But good question. Thank you. Uh-huh. Okay.